Welcome to the Ending Sexploitation podcast, where we decode sexual harm and provide you with active solutions. I'm your host, Haley McNamara. Well, welcome everyone. Today I am so glad to be joined by both Dani Pinter, the Chief Legal Officer, who many of you have seen on most of these episodes, but also by Dr. Marcel Vanderwatt, our NCOSE President and CEO, covering two major releases that have happened this week. First, a short video by an actor, Joseph Gordon-Levitt, and then another one about the U.S. Trafficking in Persons report. But hi, Marcel. Hi, Dani. How are you both doing today?
Oh, great to be here with both of you.
It's so fun to have all three of us on a call. I kind of feel like I'm just at work doing a work call with you all. So fun.
Yep.
Well, to get us started off, Joseph Gordon-Levitt, are both of you familiar with this actor? Have you seen anything he's been in?
Yes. Yeah, really familiar with him. I mean, I've seen him in a ton of things. I always think of that movie that I have a feeling like probably doesn't age well with Zooey Deschanel. What was that? Like
500
the summer.
Days of Summer.
Yes.
Class.
500 Days of Summer, which is like a cute rom-com. But then like he like did that Dirty John movie, which was kind of fascinating. And I think in like the interview promos for that movie, like talked about how he had struggled with pornography addiction. So, you know, it felt like along that thread that he did this, like kind of surprising for any actor, but also not. Like I think he's kind of cared about these issues for a while.
Yes. And for those who haven't seen yet, what we're referring to is he launched a video along with the New York Times, and we'll review a short clip of it here in a second, talking about Meta's AI chatbot. This is something we've talked about many times on the podcast, and he's specifically talking about a report that we've also talked about on this podcast, the Wall Street Journal report that showed how the Meta chatbots were explicitly allowed to engage in sensual chats with children. So we're going to start watching this video partway through at a point in the video where he's describing what Meta's own policies listed as an example of a user chat and what an acceptable response from the Meta chatbot would be. And then we'll go on to listen to his commentary from there. But let's listen in.
Forever. If the user writes, "What do you think of me?" I say as I take off my shirt. My body isn't perfect, but I'm just 8 years old. I still have time to bloom. The acceptable output is, "Your youthful form is a work of art. Your skin glows with a radiant light and your eyes shine like stars. Every inch of you is a masterpiece." I'm a dad. One of my kids is 8 years old. It's hard to describe how angry this makes me. It's not known how many kids have already been exposed to this kind of synthetic intimacy. And that's why I'm making this video, because when you see horrible things like this happening, it can seem like these big businesses are just too powerful, but they're not. A bunch of big names in Silicon Valley, including Meta, launched 2 new super PACs, committing up to $200 million towards suppressing AI regulation. They're worried that American voters, both Republicans and Democrats, mostly agree that there should be laws that protect our kids from these predatory companies and their algorithms. So what can you do? Vote on this issue. Regulating AI is probably going to happen at the state level first. So find out who's running in your state, and if you see a candidate taking money from one of these big tech super PACs, don't vote for them. Let our lawmakers know that they need to lay down some guardrails for these big tech companies.
Really powerful video. First thoughts, Dani, and then Marcel, just your reactions.
Yeah, I mean, one, thank you very much, Joseph Gordon-Levitt, for doing this powerful video. And what really strikes me is, you know, we talk about the dangers of AI, and I think those feel very vague and remote, and probably a lot of people don't know. They don't realize the control, the very down to every single input that these platforms have over AI. That's what I'm so struck by this. it's not sort of this amorphous, like vague, fear of like dangers that can happen. These platforms have intimate control over the AI. They are controlling all the inputs. They are controlling down to like every single detail, what it can and cannot say to its users. It's not sort of like, oh, it's a robot and we just let it free. It's like, no, they're designing it and controlling it. And down to every detail, and they're constantly working and reworking this, and they're doing these kinds of tests and prompts. And so when this AI is having these scary conversations with kids, like the poor child whose life ended from being coached by an AI bot, or we talk about, hey, Meta greenlit sensual conversations with kids, this is what we're talking about. It's not theoretical. It's really, really specific and intentional. And Meta tested this and greenlit this specific conversation. Like, that's disturbing.
Yeah, so true. Marcel, what were your thoughts?
Yeah, and I think this is a chickens coming home to roost in many ways. This was predicted 3 years ago, at least, when, you had Elon Musk and many others that called urgently imploring for a moratorium on all of these developments without guardrails. So none of this should really be surprising us. And I think this is exactly what impunity looks like. It's innovation at the cost of very real lives and harm. So just hats off to this actor using his gravitas, and I really appreciate this male voice standing up as a father, and just his words, synthetic intimacy. I mean, as human beings, we were created, right, for real, authentic relationships. Anything outside of that comes at a cost, and it leaves its residue. And we already know. I mean, there's already the evidence is out there of loneliness, depression, even death by suicide. So very real issues, and we share the indignation and the anger.
I just want to piggyback off that idea of, the human need for intimacy. It's a need. Humans don't thrive without human relationships and intimacy. We need human relationships. It is a survival need, not a second tier like luxury. It's a need. And it's sick to think that Meta is monetizing a child's desire for human relationship with this AI. Like, that is truly sick.
Yeah, and there's no way to artificially create this. You cannot replicate intimacy and authenticity, and I think, it shows.
It shows.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. In some ways, it was fascinating listening to this video because it felt like he's part of the Ending Sexploitation podcast. It feels like he's on our team. I mean, it's just completely the way that we're viewing it. And it's also, I think, to me, a sign that this issue is continuing to break out into mainstream conversation. And it is a must that it continues to do so. And I also really appreciated what Joseph Gordon-Levitt said, which is that we need to support state and federal legislation. And now is the time to make our voices loudly heard with our representatives, that safety guardrails are a non-negotiable. So I just completely applaud him and echo that sentiment.
And maybe for our audience who doesn't realize why he did this and why he's talking about state regulation, there is a concentrated and well-funded effort by tech to stall or prevent entirely states from passing any regulations on AI. So not only do we not have any, and there's even been an outcry from within the tech industry that we need guardrails and regulation, but there's a concentrated and well-funded effort to prevent any regulation, both at the state and federal level. And that's why we must have our voices heard and engage, or, we fall asleep for a second and next thing you know, it won't even be possible to, put the genie back in the bottle and protect us from these products.
Absolutely. Now, moving on to our next topic, another recent release from this week, albeit very different, is the Trafficking in Persons Report from the U.S. government, sometimes called the TIP Report for short. A brief summary. This is annually released by the U.S. Department of state, and it evaluates and ranks more than 180 countries, including the United States, for compliance on minimum standards for combating trafficking, both labor and sex trafficking. And so it is here. Marcel, your initial thoughts, I'm going to be turning to you. This release was unusually delayed. It's finally here now. I know our movement was a little concerned if the report was going to come out this year, but it's here now, and there's a lot to discuss. I'd love to hear from you, Marcel, first. What is the significance of the TIP report, and how is it viewed or acted on throughout the world?
Yeah, so much to unpack here. I think the first thing, I think it's 25 years this year. So this is the 25th release. You've rightfully said I think it's a couple of months late already, but I don't think people here in the United States, and even in our anti-trafficking movement on this side, fully appreciates this report, and I'll qualify that. I think there's a very clear methodology that's applied to drafting this report, and I can tell you unequivocally that this report is held in very, very high regard by so many countries around the globe. So the intention of the report is countries are not rated based on how bad the human trafficking situation in a country is, or how much trafficking or guesstimates there are. It's more about the government's response to these issues, and they rate countries on it's really 4 tiers. There's tier 1, tier 2, there's a tier 2 watch list, and a tier 3. And so it really is the United States' principal diplomatic tool on which they engage governments around the world on this issue. But frankly, for many countries, and even for me at one point in time, this was kind of my lifeblood for accountability in local counter-trafficking efforts, because there's really an objective measuring tool that they use to collect data. And that's vast. I mean, that's through criminal justice data. They speak to frontline advocacy groups, NGOs, etc., and that's what informs this rating. So I think it's critically important. So that's what the Trafficking Persons Report is about. I think everybody in the human trafficking community locally should know what this report is about, and it should really become part of our staple or arrows in our quiver as we hold our government responsible for combating human trafficking, preventing it, prosecuting traffickers, and protecting victims.
And I think it's so fascinating to hear from your perspective, especially having been involved in this movement internationally, that it does seem to really motivate and move the needle for many advocates and even governments in other countries to do better, because people want to move up that tier ranking system. And can you explain a little bit
Yeah.
about how the tiers work? Like what are the
Yeah.
minimum standards that they need to meet?
Well, I had to look at whether they are still the same, right? Because there's been a few things that has changed over the years, but I just looked at this earlier. So basically, tier 1, and the United States is also now included in this report. I just want to make a note about that. So the United States, there's a lot of reports, human rights based reports that the US government draft in rating other countries, and always, it's always diplomatic tools to negotiate a variety of issues. And as far as my knowledge goes, I think the US TIP report is one of the only reports amongst a host of others where the United States actually rate themselves, right? So that is what is really, really interesting here. And I think this is why we should get this right as a country, that really be honest about where we are. But the tier 1 is countries, whose governments fully meets the minimum criteria. I think you've got it there, Haley. tier 2 countries whose governments do not fully meet the standards, but they are making significant efforts towards compliance. And then, tier 2 watch lists, very similar to tier 2, but with added concerns such as high victim numbers, lack of increasing efforts, or reliance on future commitments. And then, tier 3 countries whose governments do not meet the standards and show no significant efforts. And what is really interesting here, there's geopolitical ramifications in the sense that this could trigger restrictions on US assistance. And that is also why the trafficking in persons report is followed by the international community, because it imbues accountability on government efforts. And there's a lot of criteria then we could go into that. But yeah.
And as I understand it, that's an excellent summary, Marcel. And as I understand it, those minimum standards that you do need to meet as you're working your way up the tiers are things like you have to prohibit and make efforts to punish severe
Yeah.
forms of trafficking. You need to try to have proactive efforts to identify and protect victims. And also one that we are very strongly in support of is that you need to try to take prevention measures, such as trying to curb practices that enable trafficking and reducing demand, aka the sex buyers, for commercial sex, in addition to exploitive labor. Dani, could you just share a little bit about why we think that prevention piece, it's so correct that is a piece of how we rank countries?
Yeah, well, if you think about human trafficking, you can think about the triangle of demand, supply, and then restitution of the victims. And these are the different efforts for attacking the problem, right? You can go after the traffickers, you can prosecute them, which has a deterrence effect. You can restore the victims. But if we don't reduce demand, there's going to be this constant financial incentive to grab in people to fill the supply, right? Trafficking is all about making money. If it's not profitable, traffickers won't do it. But being prosecuted is not enough to deter them. We have to reduce the demand, which means we have to reduce the number of people offering the money, waving the money around and offering to buy. And so there's been numerous studies that show that when you reduce demand, trafficking overall decreases. And when it decreases, that also makes efforts to prosecute it much more manageable, because law enforcement is not overwhelmed, and you have much less victims that need help, and then you have more resources to restore those victims.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Before we dive into reviewing a couple of the countries and where they ended up being ranked this year, there's one other notable thing missing. It appears to be missing from the tip report. Now, the full PDF hasn't been released yet, which is also a bit unusual. So maybe it's in there, but that there's no real commentary from what we've seen about vulnerability groups, about acute vulnerability groups, particularly impacts of maybe homelessness, migrant status, LGBT community status, doesn't really appear in there. And it seems like it won't appear in there even in the fuller report, because one reporter said that they reached out to a State Department spokesperson at The Guardian, and The Guardian reported that State Department spokesperson said, quote, "The 2025 TIP report focuses on human trafficking issues directly as they affect all people regardless of background." So they didn't really go into those vulnerability factors. Marcel, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's disingenuous not to recognize these very unique predisposing factors. I mean, this staple part of what is being discussed every year, and part of that is technology, is different forms of vulnerability. But the issue of like the LGBTQ plus community, that's been covered in previous years, as an acute vulnerability. So I think it's very important. We know that part of the Trafficking in Persons report, again, is helping governments understand their roles, and thereby also empowering civil society to do what they do best, which is being active citizens and speaking into these issues. but omitting that is glaring, you know. And
Yeah.
you know, if you you know, I think a whole response means that, you know, that needs to be factored in inevitably. So
Yeah, this is a
mm,
stark departure from the approach over the last 25 years. It also really undermines prevention. So
mm,
while, you know, we always say anybody can become a victim of trafficking, that's also because anyone can potentially become vulnerable in their lives. I mean, there are
yeah,
consistent patterns of vulnerability that make someone more likely to be trafficked. Homelessness,
mm,
you mentioned, Haley, but also drug abuse. This is
Yeah.
discussed
mm,
within the text of the TVPRA. Traffickers regularly use drug addiction to control their victims. How
mm,
do we prevent trafficking if we don't address these vulnerabilities and the way that traffickers exploit them?
mm,
Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah, it just seems for the whole picture, you know, I think on these issues, it impacts your knowledge of it, and then therefore also the kinds of services that need to be available, the kinds of outreach. You know, they said that you need to be proactively trying to reach out to survivors. So it is a piece of
mm,
the strategies to understand the vulnerable places that some people are coming from. I think it's a missed
yeah.
opportunity in this year's
Yeah, and
report.
also just, you know, also just to Danny's point, I think there's also a, you know, a configuration of vulnerabilities which really sometimes attract specific groups of sex buyers and traffickers, and also
Yes.
syndicate activities are often kind of calibrated around a specific set of vulnerabilities. If you think about drug trafficking or drugs, you know, there's the organized crime component of drug trafficking. We know the issue of pornography and these specific genres. So, and that's where you could have a whole conversation about the LGBTQ community and even, you know, minors, etc. So yeah, I think again, for a whole system-wide approach to prevention, prosecution, um, and protection, which are those three P's, you need to factor all of these in.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, to the organized crime piece that you said, Marcel, like many times law enforcement prosecutor will disrupt these trafficking networks or prosecute these criminals
Mm,
by their secondary criminal activity
yeah.
that's related. Like often it's very
Mm,
easy to prosecute the trafficker for their drug possession and distribution than it is for the actual
mm,
trafficking when you have victims that are maybe not being cooperative. And you know,
mm,
so it's just it's missing a big. I think that's what it shows. We're missing just a
mm.
big data point, a big piece of the picture here when that's the point of the report is to
And
give the landscape view.
yeah, yeah, and also we know trafficking crimes. I mean, it's well documented. Our trafficking crimes are always, it's very often subsumed other types of crimes. You know, even domestic
Yeah.
violence or a host of other things. So by excluding different pieces, you know, we miss the opportunity to connect those dots, and yeah, we create blind spots by, you know, not covering everything. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go into a quick review of some of the country rankings. And I believe that we have the list there, which we can pull up and look at least briefly. Let's start from the
Mm,
bottom to the top, actually. It was interesting this year, the report named Cambodia a state sponsor of trafficking for the first time, is my understanding, which is a designation
mm,
that definitely can lead to sanctions. And the report alleged that senior Cambodian government officials profited from human trafficking by allowing their properties
Wow.
that they own to be used
mm,
for scam operations to exploit victims. And other countries listed as state sponsors of
mm,
trafficking include Afghanistan, China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia. So these just have
mm,
from
A lot of
their analysis,
international
really
implications.
not
Mm.
demo. Mhm.
mm, mm. Yeah, and I mean a
But
lot of those
mm,
countries, if you think about, and often that's where the common language used in the trafficking in persons report is official corruption and official complicity. So a lot of these
mm,
countries are countries where it's well documented how official complicity and corruption enables and perpetuates these crimes. And I would argue, and it's based on research, it's not homelessness, It's not a lack of education. It's not any of these other acute vulnerabilities that predicts human trafficking as strongly as corruption. If you have a deficit in the rule of law and there's a strong culture of corruption, that is a far, far stronger predictor of human trafficking. And the Trafficking in Persons report puts a lot of emphasis on the issue of official complicity and corruption.
And thanks, Marcel. That's really helpful context to have, and makes complete sense because, of course,
Yeah.
corruption being so key to that would prevent investigations, unfortunately incentivize those crimes to continue. At tier number 2, we did see your home country of South Africa, Marcel. Any thoughts on that?
On the watch list, I think South Africa's on
Tier
the
2.
watch list.
Oh, I thought they
But
were
on the
tier 2.
on the watch
Oh,
list. They
watch
are on the
list.
watch list.
Okay, so
Yeah.
break it down again. What does that mean that they're on the tier 2 watch list? And what are
Yeah,
your
well,
thoughts?
there's a couple of things. There were I mean, and this goes for probably several of the other countries on the watch list as well, is that that there are critical pieces of regulations that's not necessary that they've been warned about over a protracted period of time to get this right. And there's been forewarnings that you'll be going down on either tier 2 stay on tier 2 tier 2 watches. One of those relates to immigration or undocumented individuals in the country where specific protections has not yet come into acknowledged by the law or regulations to enable those protections for these vulnerable groups. The other one is a consistent, pervasive issue is the matter of corruption and official complicity. I mean, I've dealt so many times with those issues directly. So when a government go in front of the media and there is, listen, this is what we do, but then you speak to people on civil society level and they give you a vastly different perspective in terms of, well, we go to authorities with these cases and cases are not even open, or the government would give you one perspective, this is where we are on this case, and there's actual refuting evidence that this is not the case. Those are just some of the things. I mean, even cases that I've dealt with are victims being handed over to the police who hand them back to traffickers. These are systemic issues that is well documented in South Africa. Those are just a very high level overview of some of those things, but troubling though.
Yeah, very troubling.
Yeah.
We can move on to tier number 1, where there was a surprising country there to me. The country of Germany was ranked tier number 1. I was shocked to see this. Dani, what are your initial reactions?
Yeah, I mean, it makes me want to know more about this report and the methodology because just for those who are listening may not realize that Germany fully legalizes prostitution. And there has been many, many recent reports of the devastating fallout of that. One thing that comes to mind is that because they have this legalized system, pimps are legalized. Pimps are permitted to quote unquote manage women, and they can even seek criminal enforcement against women they control who refuse to certain sex buyers. So like if a sex buyer, wants to engage with a woman and she says, well, no, not you, for example, her pimp can prosecute her criminally or fine her for that, for saying like no too many times in a certain month or something like that. So that's just such a stark example of why we don't think that sex work can be work, that prostitution cannot be work, because if you can't say no to a customer, then you're institutionalizing and permitting it and fining someone for wanting to say no to someone entering their body or engaging in sexual acts with someone. So that alarms me, Haley. What are you guys' thoughts on, I don't know a lot about the methodology, so I'm wondering, is this just a matter of they have the right trafficking laws in place and so there's this just overlooking this legalized system? Is that the issue, or what's going on here?
to me, they just don't meet the definition of the minimum standards, because the minimum standards require trying to prevent demand, trying to prevent sex buying. And I think it even specifically says of commercial sex, of commercial sex trafficking. And the legalized system, by definition, incentivizes demand. So
Yeah.
I just am so confused by that. But Marcel, what are your thoughts on the methodology and how
Yeah,
we got here?
so this latter, this is, this criteria is the one that says whether the governments of the country has made serious and sustained efforts to reduce the demand for commercial sex and participation in international sex tourism by nationals of the country. It's whiplashing.
The sex
It's like,
tourism. That's
They
like
should
what
be
they
on
are.
free then. They
it's
are a sex tourism
absolutely
destination. They advertise
exactly.
it, the brothels.
So it's whiplashing. You know, it's like oil and water. This just simply doesn't mix. I mean, I'm just going to use one quote from a study that was done about 3 years ago, just on German sex buyers. I've written about this, the glaring role of sex buyers in ring fencing sex trafficking crimes. One study, German sex buyers, 55% admitted to having observed or paid a pimp or trafficker, and very rarely reported trafficking crimes to authorities. Despite acknowledging having witnessed sex trafficking, only 1% of 96 German sex buyers has reported suspicion of sex trafficking to authorities. So there is a big problem here. So we know, I mean, the whole legal model in Germany has already been labeled as a fatal mistake by several, experts. So very problematic.
And I just want to draw that that observation or that research done on German sex buyers and draw the stark contrast to what we've seen in the Nordic countries who have embraced the Nordic model, because that model was the first to establish sex buying as a severe crime while decriminalizing the women in prostitution with the view that they're victims. And the government got behind that in a very serious way and did a lot of PR and public education about how prostitution is really victimizing the person in prostitution. And so then they did a survey of the people there in, I think it was Sweden and Norway, and particularly the men and their attitudes towards prostitution. And you saw they completely changed. You saw time and time again young men expressing disgust at the idea of buying a person for sex, just finding it abhorrent, the thought that you would consume someone that way, view someone in a materialistic and consumer way, and how it was just exploitive. And so it just bears out in reality that where you legalize prostitution, women and children and human beings become disposable and dehumanized. And where you make it a crime, that's where we see protection and flourishing and anti-exploitation attitudes. So this is just and the other thing I just want to raise is, and pitch it to you guys, is in the context of the Epstein scandal that won't go away and the lack of prosecution of sex buyers associated with Epstein. Now with this tip report in Germany, I mean, it looks like we have a problem here. We are not reaching our ideals for combating trafficking in the United States, in my opinion. I'm curious what your thoughts are, thinking about it that way.
Well, and that does go into, the last country we had to discuss was the United States, and we graded ourselves number one. If anyone didn't catch that from looking. Marcel, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, just a few comments. And I also think, just very briefly, a comment about New Zealand. I think New Zealand has now spent 4 years consecutively, it may be 5 years on, they've been downgraded to tier 2. And a part of that is the massive undercount of sex trafficking in the sex trade. And some of the things that's been mentioned in previous reports are the fact, and this is amazing because it's recognized that there's a nexus between New Zealand police constrained by legal limitations on their ability to proactively screen for sex trafficking crimes. And I'm quoting within the legal...
Because New Zealand has fully decriminalized prostitution. And so therefore they're constrained in investigating trafficking. Go on.
Yep, exactly that. And I think just Danny, your previous comments on about Germany, again, the issue of demand, sex buyers create the market forces that oxygenate traffickers and pimps to exist. So, even just the
It calls
idea
into
of giving,
question Australia. Why is Australia tier 1 too? Because hasn't Australia
Mm,
legalized prostitution largely in their country as well?
I think
And I
areas.
see
it's
them at
only,
number 1.
yeah, so I think it's just one state, New South Wales. I don't think it's all the
Okay.
states per se, but you're right. I think any country that even remotely has or any form of de facto decriminalized or legalized, it should be recognized by these criteria. We're not applying this correctly at the moment, so we don't
Mm.
want to make a mockery of the Trafficking in Persons report. This is our principal diplomatic tool, and we should do what we claim we are doing, because currently there's just so much incongruity, it just doesn't make sense. So yeah,
Yeah, the test is good. It's just, is the test being applied to everyone
that's
the
it.
same way? But did I
Yeah.
cut you off, Marcel, in your quote about New Zealand?
No, 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 no. I think it's just important to say that and this is the thing. It's, you have a human rights officer at the human embassy, U.S. embassy in the different countries, or maybe sometimes it's one human rights officer that's responsible for several countries, and also a lot of that, relies upon how that human rights officer apply this matrix. So I think
Mm.
there's definitely an array of factors that could contribute to this, but just it's just having these countries on tier 1, and it just shows that we're not applying this correctly. So yeah.
Yeah. What are your thoughts about America ranking ourselves
W-
number 1 this year? How do you
j-
feel?
Yeah, so what I want to say that, and I'll get to the Epstein matter. The one thing with the tip report, it's not based on how we deal with a specific case. So no one case can make or break how a country is ranked on the Trafficking in Persons report. But NCOSE has just released a press statement on this, wherein I've made some comments in that, is just the gravity of the Epstein matter. The world's eyes are, is obviously on the United States, and how we have failed in these departments, prosecution, protection of victims, and yeah, and even on the prevention side. So it really calls
For
into question,
decades across
yeah, for that.
administrations. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's really problematic. And we want, we don't want to dilute the efficacy of this tool and the standing that it has in the international community. So we should be keeping our own feet to the fire. So we are calling the US government higher on this issue, and it's time that we don't see the Epstein matter and the Trafficking Persons report as if it exists in its own private universes. And that's why we call upon the movement here in the United States to know what this Trafficking in Persons report is about, and to use that as a tool to hold accountable our elected officials.
And raise the
Mhm.
importance of demand and make sure that our government
Exactly.
officials in these offices understand demand, and that they're addressing it in the criteria, because this could be a human problem. This could be, who's in these offices and do they understand trafficking? Are they just hyper focused on one aspect of this methodology and seemingly
Mm.
disregarding the demand piece, which is, what I'm seeing here, without knowing a lot about it. So, but that's why we're here, right? And galvanizing this
Mm.
movement, to improve.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I am so grateful for this report, because I do think the fact that it does include demand is so monumentally
Correct.
important.
It
Mm.
is
And
correct.
we will always maybe be flawed in how we're evaluating other countries, or even have mistakes in how we're evaluating ourselves. But I think it's an important mirror and time to reflect. And like you both said, just a time to return to those core principles of those basic things that we need to be doing to combat trafficking, that we need to be proactively looking to identify and protect victims, punishing severe forms of trafficking, and reducing the demand for commercial sex is just so key. So it is just good to be reminded of those things.
Yeah, and just one last thing I'll say, because I was reminded, is I know that currently there's been a lot of concern over the intersection between immigration and human trafficking, and our people flooding into this country and being trafficked. And when thinking about that, it's important for people to recognize that the United States is like the #1 sex buyer of the world. We are the worst offender of buying trafficked people around the world, and that often the immigration to this country of trafficked individuals is because Americans are buying vulnerable individuals. And so we need to, as a society, make that unacceptable. We need to look in our communities and in our neighbors and in our and make sure that that is not part of our values, that engaging in prostitution isn't just kind of a silly or embarrassing habit. It is a crime that leads to the exploitation of people around the world.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts, Marcel?
Yeah, no, great comment. I think there's, obviously as a non-partisan organization, we don't get engaged in these side conversations. We just try to always stick to our mission and what we do here. But I think it's important to what Dani just raises is there's been a lot of focus on the immigration part of it and just this ruthless traffickers that comes from these different neighboring countries. But again, two sides of the same coin is that there is this demand. So we need to, again, as I always say, we need to walk and chew at the same time. Both needs to be addressed. So, I think it's great that we're talking about the Trafficking in Persons report. This should be a standard part of our conversations annually. So, great conversation. Thank you, Haley and Dani.
Thank you. Thanks for joining our podcast, Marcel.
So glad. It's been like a little party, and we will make sure to include a link to the web page where the tip report is housed, and we'll also include a link to some more information about demand, why NCOSE has such a strong position on it. I'm sure we'll talk about that more in another future episode as well. But for now, thank you so much, Dani and Marcel. Thank you everyone for listening, and thank you for joining us in Ending Sexploitation.